Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. My name's Helen Looking. I'm Head of Family Law at Napthens Solicitors, and in this episode, we're going to look at the subject of how employers can assist employees who are potentially suffering from domestic abuse. With the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill having its second reading in the House of Commons, that's a private member's bill, and the Employment Rights Bill having its third reading in the House of Lords, and that bill is to introduce rights and protection for victims of domestic abuse. It's important for us to understand the role that employers can play in supporting their employees who are victims of domestic abuse. We know that almost 90% of workers who are suffering from domestic abuse admit that it impacts on their performance at work. And over half of those who are experiencing domestic abuse have to take time off work as a result of the abuse, and nearly half of them were late for work. Today, I'm joined by Ollie McCann, an employment partner at AfterAthena, part of the Napthens Group, and Scott Allen, who is a detective sergeant in Merseyside's Police Protecting Vulnerable People Department, who specialises in supporting victims of domestic abuse. Together, we're going to look at what employers can do to support their employees and what role the police, legal professionals, and charities can play in these difficult situations. So, I think first, Scott, what would you say is domestic abuse?
Domestic abuse is typically manifested around either a pattern of behaviour or even an isolated incident between a partner, an intimate partner, or even a family member, a brother, a sister, mum, dad, where that perpetrator or abuser will have some sort of power over the victim, whether that be physically, mentally, emotionally. Domestic abuse can come in loads of different areas, some that people can see, some that you can't. But ultimately, that victim is empowered by that abuser.
I see. And as an employer, how would you spot that in the workplace?
Well, as I said, it can come in various forms. The most obvious and most easiest to see is physical abuse, where you may find bruises, black eyes, scratches. It can come in emotional abuse, where they feel financially not dependent anymore because their abuser has controls over all their money. Emotional abuse as well, where they can be coming into work. Perhaps an employer will find that they come in with more makeup than they usually do, and this could be hiding signs of physical abuse. On the flip side, it could be the opposite, where their abuser doesn't want them to wear any makeup because they feel they have that control over their victim. So it can come in so many sort of different ways. There's also a change in the pattern of behaviour, the way that victims may bring themselves to work. They may be coming late. They may even come early to work because they don't want to be home, and they find that work's a safer place than at home for them. They may be they may be disappearing from work. They may be taking phone calls that they don't normally take, and this can come in a wide variety of different forms. Really,
Mm,
um,
mm,
they there are the more obvious one where an employee may confide in an employer and actually disclose domestic abuse that is happening at home, or somebody could come into the work and tell an employer something that they may have seen or heard. Another employee at the workplace could tell the employer a conversation they may have heard on the phone that may evidence the fact that there's domestic abuse in the work at home for them. So yeah, absolutely, loads of different forms of domestic abuse, really.
yes,
It's
yes.
quite interesting that I've had over the past few years a couple of scenarios where the employer has come to us for advice around concerns with domestic abuse, and that's included circumstances where a partner has insisted, well, the employee has insisted that their salary be paid into their partner's account, and that was raising alarm bells for the employer. And then the second scenario where the employee's partner was taking over control of an internal grievance process that the partner was bringing against her employer, with a view to trying to get compensation out of the employer, but it was completely controlled by the partner. And again, the employer had concerns about whether they should be reporting this in some way, shape or form, whether the employee was actually subject to the coercion or control of that partner. So it does crop up actually more frequently than employers may think.
That's interesting, isn't it? So, Scott, what impact does domestic abuse have on the individual in your experience?
What I've seen is, as a main, the victim, the employee feels very isolated, where they feel like they've got no one else they can talk to apart from the abuser. The abusers and perpetrators, what they're very good at is making the victim feel as though they're the only people that they can go to for support. And we know that's not the case, but the victims don't really. They don't want to report the matter because they don't think they'll be believed. They think the perpetrator's the only person that'll believe anything they say. They the relationship, the controlling relationship, and they feel because when you're in a controlling relationship, they get isolated from their friends, their family. They sometimes even isolate themselves from their friends and family without knowing it, where they'll take themselves away from friends and family because that's what the perpetrator wanted in that relationship. So when it comes to the time where that person feels that they need the support from their loved ones and from the people around them, they're not there anymore because they've already isolated themselves from them people.
Yes, yes. And Ollie, what impact can domestic abuse have in the workplace?
Yeah, it can have a variety of sort of impacts on the workplace. I think the most obvious one, and one you alluded to in your introduction, was the impact on the employee's performance. So productivity may well decrease. They may be more prone to making more mistakes, which could be quite costly for an employee, depending on the job that they do. They can also see it through absence from work. I think, again, you mentioned absences from work. But that could be long-term absence, but more likely to be sort of persistent, frequent absences, short-term absences, and then like on a regular basis, which is a cause for concern. And then sort of other areas where an employer may well sort of come across it is when they're actually looking to exit an employee because of performance issues or absence issues. It may well be that the cause of those are indeed domestic abuse, which is impacting upon that individual's sort of mental well-being in the workplace and their ability to deliver or their ability to attend work. And so that results in the employee having to go through a process which might result in them losing their job. The only hope is that, with the right systems and processes and policies in place, is that employees feel empowered to speak up and to raise that as the cause of it, so that employees can take that into account as mitigation before making any decisions around their continued employment.
Yes, yes. Because what are an employer's current responsibilities?
Yeah, it's currently it's quite limited, and hence the reason why the government and private members are proposing some new laws through the Employment Rights Bill and the Domestic Save Leave Bill. We are well behind other countries. So New Zealand, Ireland, Belgium all have in place legislation that gives employees rights to paid leave, to take time off to sort out their domestic arrangements to try and escape domestic violence or domestic abuse, with also sort of other steps that the employer has to be doing to try and support those employees. But currently, we have nothing like that in England and Wales. What we do have is more indirect legislation that poses some obligations on an employer. So by way of example, we have obviously the duty to protect an employee's health, safety and welfare in the workplace. And so if they are coming into work and there is a risk of, for example, violence or abuse directed towards them by their partner, who might be coming to meet them outside of work or might even come into the workplace, then there is a requirement to think of, well, what can we do to protect that individual from that? But the key is knowing about it. And so you can't really fulfill that duty unless you're aware of the issues. And I think we've got three categories of employers, really. The first is where they're completely unaware that anything's going on. Those that are aware but unsure what to do, and those that are aware and have all the policies, systems and processes in place to provide the support. And in an ideal scenario, we want employers to get into that latter category where they know exactly what to do when these things come to light, so that they're there to help the employee straight away, and they know exactly how to deliver that help, really. So yeah, it's quite limited at this moment in time, but hopefully the legislation will go through and provide some improved protection for and support for employees who are victims of domestic abuse.
So, what can employers do to support their employees who are the victims of domestic abuse?
So I think really the starting point is recognition that people may well be the subject of domestic abuse, um, and when someone does make a disclosure to the employer or to a manager or a senior leader of the employer, that they are believed. It's really important that they are believed in terms of the story that they're telling. That sort of we are very, very clear with the employee what steps we will take, and only with their consent. We're very clear with the employee what the parameters are around confidentiality of that information that's being disclosed to us, because who are they prepared to allow to know this disclosure? For example, does their line manager know, and does that line manager need to know so that they can provide that support, etc.? So conversations have to take place with the affected employee to really understand what support they want from us and how do we maintain their confidentiality. It's a bit of a journey, to be honest, and it's a two-way journey that sort of constant communication throughout, really. I think what I would say is, to get ahead of the game, it would be very well advised for employers to put in place a policy which sets out our position in terms of supporting victims of domestic abuse, what that support will look like, how employees can access that support, who can they go to disclose issues with, confidently, and the knowledge that those people know how to handle that information and how to deal with it, and clarity on what we will do to support them in terms of once that disclosure is made. Are we going to sort of signpost them? Can we help them with time off work to attend court hearings or to move, relocate, etc.? So there's a whole host of things that an employer could do to try and get ahead of the game, really.
Right, yes, thank you. Yeah. And Scott, anything else that you would recommend there?
And we're touching on a little bit of what Ollie said there. I think it's important that they have regular one-to-ones and that open door policy that the person can come to their employers. So having that constant communication with their employee will give them that a better understanding if they notice a change in that person's behaviour, which will help them to recognise signs of domestic abuse. I think if an employer does recognise that domestic abuse, identifying safe phone numbers for that victim as well. We do it within the police, that we make sure that that phone number is a safe phone number, that the perpetrator isn't one that's monitoring, and that they feel that they can comfortably speak to us. Some people are tracked on their phones, so they may not want that phone actually being used by their employer to speak to them. I think also, and there's a fine line between this, because it shouldn't be the way it is, but also making work feel like a refuge, making them feel like they want to be there, they want to confide in you. If they want to stay late because their partner works night shifts, and if they stay late just an hour or two, then they don't have to confront their partner because of something that happened the night before. I think it's important to give employees that sort of safe place to come and actually want to be. Yeah, so I think that's good. I think it's important to bear in mind, though, when you have that relationship with your employees, if it's a male perpetrator, they may not want to confide in a male member of staff or a male supervisor. So I think it's also important to remember that the gender may be important about how you manage that problem and how you support that person. I think through domestic abuse, it's quite common that victims will have post-traumatic distress disorder, and having a male support may not be what they need. They may need a female support. So I think that regular one-to-ones will recognise and will help an employer understand and recognise what that person needs, really.
Yes,
I
yeah.
think key to just picking up on Scott's point there around sort of people being able to spot the signs and provide the support. The key will be delivering training to the right people within the organisation, so that, for example, managers, line managers, etc., understand what the signs are, so that they can look after their staff, spot the signs, and keep an eye on them. Obviously, you can't prompt a conversation with those individuals to ask if they're a victim of domestic abuse, but if you're seeing signs, you can have those one-to-ones on an informal basis. Is everything okay? Any problems? Anything you want to discuss with me, etc. So that training is really important, and the ACAS guidance on domestic abuse and supporting employees in the workplace does recommend also employees putting in place domestic abuse champions, people who will go around and sort of keep sort of the information in front of the workforce around the importance of supporting people with domestic abuse who are subject to domestic abuse, the steps they can take to support, but also designated people that the victims know they can go to, who fully understand what their role is within the workplace to support them. And the other thing that employees could do to explore some kind of support is maybe financial support. Typically, when an employee is going through this process, they are going to be struggling. They're going to be looking at relocating to a new home potentially. They may well have the loss of that income from their partner. What access to benefits may they be entitled to if they separate? So they're going to need a whole host of advice, but they also may need some temporary financial support. So anything employers can do on a reasonable level would, I think, be massively helpful to the individual.
I mean, I often advise clients generally when they're splitting up that for if they're cohabitees, one person to give the other enough money for the rent and the bond. And I have had experience of employers paying for the employee to take legal advice with myself as a family lawyer, just to give them that initial advice that they need so that they can then be signposted or they know what steps to take. It's those kinds of things which are fairly low level but really quite significant, and then giving them the time off as well to be able to go and seek the advice that they need, or as you said, go to court. It's those kinds of things, but going to court's very much a last resort. And so if there are other things that you can do along the way, that I think that's really important.
And I think a victim can't really make a decision without that information in front of them, really. It's sometimes a massive step for them to take, and it's a scary step for them to take. So to have that help and that information supplied to them can really help them on that journey to making that big step and hopefully escaping the domestic abuse.
Yes, yeah. I mean, what rights do employees themselves currently have in the workplace if they are the victim of domestic abuse?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, it is limited. Hopefully it will change. If an employer does nothing, and they need to go and get help, or they need to go and attend court for whatever reason, or attend police interviews, for example, then they could take holiday leave. But do we really want employees to be taking holiday leave for something that is as stressful as that? Probably not. They could take sick leave, but then that might have a financial impact on them because they may only be entitled to statutory sick pay rather than full pay. So then they're even worse off than they were before, and it might deter them from going and getting that help and support. They may well want to sort of ask the employer to flex their hours of work. So depending on what's going on in the home. Changing their hours of work might be massively helpful for them, or they might just need time out, some flex in terms of attending appointments for a couple of hours, etc., and then get back to work. So you may well get an employee that's coming and asking for some flexible working. They do have a right to make a request for flexible working, whether it's a temporary change or a permanent change. Possibly, and Scott, you alluded to many victims suffering from sort of the mental health impacts of domestic abuse, and some even suffering from PTSD. If they are suffering from such a severe ill health issue, then number one, that health issue could in fact be a disability. And if it is a disability, they may well have the right to ask for reasonable adjustments to accommodate them in the workplace with their mental health issues. But also, if that mental health is resulting in absences and an employer is looking to manage that absence, unaware, for example, of what's going on, then they do have the right not to be unfairly dismissed. The difficulty is that unless an employer knows about what's going on, they can't take it into account. But they do have the right not to be unfairly dismissed. So, if anyone's ever in that situation in the workplace, I'd encourage them to find a way in which to make a disclosure to the employer about what they're going through at home and why it's impacting upon the performance or their absence, etc. But those are the limited rights they've currently got.
Yeah.
What I thought was quite interesting, Ollie, is obviously we go through the number of things that somebody may be considering or thinking about when they're in domestic abuse. However, that victim, and we forget about this quite a lot, that every single item on that, the victim's thinking about that all the time, how they're going to pay their rent next month because they split up and they're losing benefits, how they're going to get time off, to all these things. And for one person, I know that I'd struggle, and for one person to have all that going on as well as trying to keep together their job as well is, I think we forget about that quite.
Yeah.
It's, it's easier to talk about it than to live it is.
Absolutely.
And
And if you throw kids into the mix as well, it's so
Absolutely.
stressful. It's
Yeah.
information overload and so stressful. I can't
Yeah.
really imagine what it'd be like, to be honest.
No.
Mhm.
No. So, what legal changes can employers expect in this area?
Well, we hopefully, with the proposals through the Employment Rights Bill and the Domestic Safe Leave Bill, what is being proposed and subject to it going through Parliament and potentially getting royal assent is that the employee will be entitled to some special leave, which will be paid. Unclear whether that will be like a statutory level of pay similar to statutory maternity pay, or whether it will be full pay. But it's intended that that will be for up to 10 days, not necessarily in a block. It may well be just use the days as and when you need to, which will be a massive help. If it is full pay and it's for 10 days and it's obviously to deal with issues arising from domestic abuse, that will be a huge relief, I think, for victims of domestic abuse. The other thing that the governments are looking at is putting in place additional protection for victims of domestic abuse so that they are not either subject to a detriment or dismissed because they are a victim of domestic abuse, or for someone who is related to a victim of domestic abuse who is also suffering or having the similar issues and having to go through that process. Devil's in the detail. We haven't seen all the detail yet on what that will look like. But I think in short, what it would be suggesting is that if an employee discloses, for example, that they are a victim of domestic abuse and they were in the middle of a performance management process, then it may well mean that it would be unfair to proceed with that performance management process, because to do so would result in the dismissal being automatically unfair, which may well give employees, once they understand their rights, confidence to speak up, really. The other thing that's been mooted within the legislation is a obligation on an employer to take reasonable steps to prevent domestic abuse in the workplace. Now, we have a prevent duty already with sexual harassment in the workplace that came out in October last year, and it will follow along similar lines in that the employer has to stop an employee that was within their work environment or at outside events on behalf of work from being subject to domestic abuse. Now, I'm trying to think about the scenarios that would apply to. It could apply if you have a husband and wife or a partners or girlfriend and boyfriend or whatever it might be in a relationship within the same workplace, and there's a breakdown or there's issues going on there. And once we become aware of it, an employer will be duty bound to take steps to try and stop the victim from receiving any further domestic abuse within the workplace. The other potential scenario is where, I suppose, for example, you may well be an employer that runs a restaurant or a hotel, and so it's accessible to members of the public, which means that the victim, the employee's partner, could come into the workplace quite easily and apply some kind of intimidation or threatening behaviour just by being present. So again, once they become aware of it, they would have to take steps to prevent that from happening. For example, excluding and banning that person from entering the workplace, making sure that reception and security know not to let that person in, etc. So those steps will be, I suppose, welcome steps. It'd be interesting to see how that pans out in detail. The one thing that I do think, if this legislation goes through, which is positive, not just for the victims, but I think it will mean that employers, if they have to give paid leave to employees, in these circumstances, they will have to write a policy, and that policy will hopefully provide a bit more detail on how employees can access the special leave that they're entitled to, in what circumstances, who to speak to, etc. So it will force the issue of employers dealing with this problem that does occur in the workplace, and we will have many employees that are silent and not speaking up, that are victims, and hopefully in doing so and forcing employees to put policies in place, it will encourage more employees to step forward and seek help, really. So yeah, that's what's coming down the road. It is likely to be at least 12 months to 2 years before we actually get legislation in place, I suspect, because it's trickling through Parliament as we speak.
But it's interesting to know what is coming, but also what support can be given now, and what things that employers can do to perhaps assist already. And bearing that in mind, so Scott, so how do the police support employees and employers indeed?
Well, the police have a couple of laws. Obviously, violence against women and girls and domestic abuse has been a priority amongst police and government of recently. But unfortunately, things have had to happen in the past which have had to have laws put in place. One really useful law is Clare's law. It's also other people may have heard it as domestic violence disclosure scheme. A poor young lady called Claire Wood. She was murdered by a domestic abuse perpetrator back in 2009. In 2014, what we know as Clare's Law came into place, and what Clare's Law does is give the victims a chance to understand if they get into a new relationship, or even if they're in a current relationship, and they want to know if that new partner or that current partner's got a history of domestic abuse, the police will then tell them, and it gives them that control back. It doesn't give them that they can make their own decisions, whether that getting into a relationship with somebody with domestic abuse past is the right thing. What's important for employers to know is there's two elements to Clare's Law: the right to know and the right to ask. The right to know is a victim has the right under Clare's Law to go to police, ask them for this information, and then a specially trained officer will speak to that person and give them the information so they can either protect themselves, their children, their wider family. Um, an employer can ask the police. So, because of GDPR, because of human rights, obviously, the employer can't know this information. So, what the law does is it gets the information from the employer, why we're doing the request, the information about the victim and perpetrator if they know that information. And then the police will then go to the victim and say, listen, it will be kept anonymous. They don't have to know that who's asking for this information. But the police will basically sort of take it out of the victim's hands and say, look, we've been made aware you're with this person. We've been asked to speak to you regarding Clare's Law. And then without the victim having to pick up the phone and make that decision, police will go straight to the victim because of what the employer's done and ask the police to go and speak to them regarding Clare's Law.
That's really interesting. That I wasn't aware that employers could potentially take that step forward and ask the police for that, well, to look into it and see if there is an issue. So I think based on that and what you've just said there, Scott, and thinking about, maybe employers that do want to put a policy in place, would it be sensible then for employers to put something within their policy about the employee's ability to go and use Clare's Law to ask themselves, to know the information, but also to flag that an employer can ask on behalf of the employee?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, isn't it? And just by an employer knowing that Clare's Law is an option there, I think it's just another way we can safeguard our victim. I mean, that person may not leave the perpetrator. Like I said, they have so much control over them. It just gives them that knowledge about to potentially, save them from further domestic abuse. There are other charities as well that can really support victims. And again, it's about what the employer knows to sort of support, because none of these need to be done by the victim themselves. The National Centre for Domestic Violence, they're a charity, and they can get a restraining order for a victim free of charge based on circumstances. They're all charity bases. And somebody, either police, a family member, an employee, can actually go to the National Centre for Domestic Violence and refer them to them. And they're great. I mean, the times I've referred them, the same day they've called the victim, and they can really give support. Throughout the country as well, you may or may not have heard of independent domestic violence advocates, and they're there to really support a victim. So an employer may not be specialised. I think it's great what you said there, Ollie, about domestic abuse champions in the workplace, and I think that's great because it's really hard to get this information and this kind of knowledge around to all your staff and supervisors. But by having somebody that's well versed and is really knowledgeable of this information, Clare's Law, the National Centre for Domestic Violence, it gives somebody that point of call that they know they can feel comfortable about going to that person. But as I was saying, our independent domestic violence advocates, they're there they can come into work, they can meet a victim where they feel safe. That might be with the employer. They also have safe places. They'll meet you at the coffee shop and completely take it from making a victim feel they're going through a process, if that's what you want to call it, and make them feel like they're a person again and that they have control over what happens. And these independent domestic violence advocates, sorry, I can't get my words out, go all the way through interviews, through family court proceedings, criminal court proceedings, and they'll be there with you every step of the way. So again, it's just sort of knowledge and knowing that they're there because they're all over the country, and it's great to have them to support victims. Really,
Are they charity based as well?
they are charity based.
Right,
Yeah,
yes.
it costs a victim absolutely nothing or an employer anything to get that support. And they're run. I mean, I work within Merseyside, as you mentioned before, Helen, and we use Safe to Speak and First Steps, and they're based on the council area, so it won't be them specific domestic charities you'd go to, but all it would take is a simple internet search and find your local one, and they're absolutely great, really are.
Yes, yeah, I know. Sort of in Lancashire, there's a charity called Women's Aid, and they do. It'll be the similar kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that. I mean, it's not necessarily the domestic abuse sort of topic, but I recently advised an employer who was dealing with a situation between two employees where the male employee was essentially stalking the female employee, and it had been going on for well over a year. Despite intervention, despite trying to get this employee to back off, put boundaries in place, etc., became apparent that he was sort of literally social media messages were just ridiculously obsessed with this individual. And the client comes to me for advice, and I'm not an expert in stalking and how to deal with it. What we did know is that this employee that was the perpetrator couldn't stay in the workplace. But our biggest concern is how did we sort of remove that individual from the workplace without it being a potential trigger for something more sinister after the event. So we involved the stalking charity in the discussions in how we manage this situation before we push the button on any steps to remove that individual. And that included getting the charity involved and speaking to the charity alongside the employee and having everything in place ready to go as soon as we're ready to move forward. So the charity's support in that situation was amazing, and I suspect to be something very similar in domestic abuse situations. So again, that's down to the employee being willing for the employer to work alongside the charity to support the employee, but that comes back round to the culture of providing support, really.
Yes, it does. What else can employers do to help employees?
Yeah, I think sort of without banging the drum too much, I think the biggest help they can do is put in place a policy. I'd encourage employers not to wait for the legislation to come through. It probably will come through, so why not get ahead of the game? Why not have a look at, well, what are your values as an employer? If one of your values is about looking after your people, then are we really looking after our own people if we're not putting in place policies such as a domestic abuse protection policy? So a policy which is very clear in terms of the support that we will give, the culture of support, putting domestic abuse champions in place, training to line managers to spot the signs of potential domestic abuse, and how to have informal conversations that don't actually ask questions about domestic abuse, but maybe glean information from employees to know whether there's an underlying problem at home. All of that will be massively helpful, but I think as helpful will be the need, will be some leniency in attendance, ability to take time off, paid ideally, and that can be done on a discretionary basis. Employers don't need to be waiting to be told by the government to do it. And actually, if that employee is a valued employee, our job is to ideally protect them and keep them an employee of ours for as long as we possibly can do. And the support we will give them through such a situation with that they're going through, and hopefully see them out the other end where they've escaped the domestic abuse, they're independent and they're living a new life. Still as an employee, they'll be forever sort of grateful for that support, and will have delivered on the values that our employers talk about in terms of looking after people.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've had a couple of situations where employers have supported an employee, as I think I mentioned earlier, and I had one fairly recently where the employer rang up on behalf of the employee and made the initial inquiry, booked the meeting, and came to the meeting with the employee and supported them in the meeting, because that was fine by them. But there was clearly a very trusted relationship between the two. But it's knowing, as you say, if your employment is your safe space, it's being able to know that that is somewhere where you can confide in people as well, and give them and let them know what you're going through, so they can then adjust, as you say, working policies and whatever accordingly. I mean, from my point of view as a family lawyer, it's very important that people get legal advice very early on, and so they are aware of all the elements which come into that particularly overlap with domestic abuse, because it might be that you have to get an injunction. And my advice is always to call the police as your first port of call, because they're the ones who've really got the powers. But the court does have powers regarding non-molestation orders or occupation orders to get somebody out of a property if there is a domestic abuse situation. But also the other things like advice with regard to children, advice with regard to property, and the relationship breakdown generally. And then it might be moving on, as we've said, about housing needs, and there's all things. It's all just interacts in so many different areas, doesn't it? And then sort of post-event support from the employer to the employee. Ollie, have you got anything that you could say about that?
I think it's more just about keeping in contact with the employee, even after you've done everything you can do as
Yes.
an employer. Um, those conversations need to continue until we are absolutely confident that that individual has escaped the relationship and is in a safe place, outside, not just inside work, and that they are settled in their new home, but that the children are settled in a new school, for example, whatever it might be. But just making sure that we don't end that journey just once we've ticked the box under our policy, that we carry on those conversations with the individual and make sure that they are moving in the right direction. There's no setbacks, and keeping that door open. That open door policy is so important for the employee to step forward. If there's a setback in that journey, then hopefully they can step through the door and ask for more help if needed.
Super, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Scott and Ollie. That's been very interesting. Thank you for joining me. It's a very sensitive subject, is domestic abuse in the workplace, but it's clear that there are lots of things that the employer can do, and obviously with the police support as well. So if you would like to find out more details of the support available, then you can from AfterAthena and Napthens on our website. Thank you very much for listening and watching.